This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. He shares that while the markets have been in quite the lull lately, there's still lots to look forward to. Soybean exports remain up for the U.S., but the soon-to-be-harvested Brazilian crop may soon change that. Also ahead, the Beef Cattle Institute team has launched a new podcast. Bovine Science with BCI is now live, and I got an inside scoop from team members Brad White, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, and Dustin Pendell on why they decided to launch a new podcast in addition to BCI's Cattle Chat. During our visit, they also shared information on 3 different rural veterinary grants available, 2 through the USDA, and 1 specific to K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine. We end with this week's agricultural weather report, where K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond highlights some of the fluctuating temperatures we've seen across the state in the last week or so. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Dan O'Brien. He is our K-State grain economist for this week's grain market update. So, Dan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity, Samantha. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's start, as always, with our future and cash markets for the past week.
We had the USDA report that came out on Wednesday, and not a lot of fireworks on that. In fact, after absorbing the info in kind of a mixed manner for most of these commodities on the day of the report, came in and everything was down on Thursday, yesterday, but not down in dramatic, dire amounts. Again, corn, the lead contract for March 23 for corn, 670 and 3/4. Yes, we have been higher than that. The high on that contract, recent high, about 710, and the low about 640. So when you look at where 670 is, it's just right in the middle. And new crop bids, decent corn, 590 and a half. And again, that's, we have seen over 6. So again, kind of a sideways, almost a malaise going on in that market. Wheat prices did close yesterday down 17 cents, but we just had volatility up and down, hopping around, weather-related issues, whatever else, a little bit of export news in the short run. March closed at 8.79, and we have seen that price up as high as 9 in the short term, as high as over $10 if you go back to last September, October. So we're really not having big moves there. I think I assess the wheat market is kind of in a situation of seeing where we're at once we break dormancy. I see if there are any problems off the rest of the world. Large crops in Australia and Russia exports still happening are all kind of weighing on that. On the soybean market, March closed at 15.19, still tremendously high prices, and new crop bids closed at 13.65. That'd be the November contract. So I think for soybeans, I'm certainly affected by the big news that came out of that report. That was cutbacks because of drought in Argentina, both in corn and the soybeans. And especially for soybeans, we have in-country reports coming from U.S. attaches that are markedly lower than what reporting numbers below 40 million metric tons, markedly lower than what the USDA is talking about. It may not be a case of where we're at right now, but where we think we might end up going in the soybean market. So got issues like that going on. And for new crop bids, we do have the general sideways move in corn markets still affecting cash prices. And we've seen, again, I call it the February staleness, where not seeing, I guess, the fireworks strong basis levels in Kansas we'd seen before the first of the year. Still positive, very strong. New crop bids in a number of areas, about 20, 25, 40, 30 under, except in Garden City and Hutchinson. Hutchinson, their best bids, even money. So that's good. And generally positive basis bids for sorghum, running from a low of 5 over up to 40 over in the Garden City area, 44 over in Hutchinson. So you hear discussion of movement now of grain sorghum into different areas. In my view, that's kind of making up for all the weakness that they're having on export. Just almost non-existent exports, but some domestic demand coming in and picking up the slack. So that's a great thing. And for soybeans, again, generally a lot of variability around the state. The strongest basis bids that I've seen were in Topeka, 30 over, Hutchinson, 5 over, 11 over around the Columbus area. Others not far off of that, about 11 under in Salina, 25, 6,500 Colby, Garden City. So soybean markets pretty strong. We're still seeing pretty good soybean exports, kind of waiting for the other shoe to fall when Brazil finally gets their crop out. But that's still providing some support for the markets. We had a week ending February the 2nd. The last USDA figures came out. Those came out Thursday morning, showing that still 67 million bushels of exports. We've been to 70, closer to 80 at times in the last several weeks. So that's really kind of a surprise that we're still maintaining that type of strength. I think it may not be so much that Brazil's slow coming out of the field, but just people anticipating that shortness, that cutback coming out of Argentina, and wondering where that will take us in the not too distant future.
With Brazil, when it comes to that timeline, when can we expect to really see that enter the market?
It's just around the corner, March, thereabouts, that they harvest those crops beginning in March, and they have so much longitude to deal with. That longitude, latitude, probably, I guess that's latitude's the right word, in terms of north to south. But anyway, the point is that their harvest season's kind of spread out, and for them it's a challenge just to get the grain out of the field and transport over the road systems out to the ports. So a lot of times when that happens, U.S. exports, instead of being 50, 60 million bushels a week, we'll drop down quite a bit to as much as 5, 10, or even less. So,
sure.
But anyway, that's not here yet.
We've talked about with Guy Allen, I believe, in the past on the show that, countries like Brazil and Argentina, they don't really have the manpower or the infrastructure to store a lot of crops that come out of their country. So a lot of this we can expect to just flood the market, right?
Right. Well, and Argentina is such an interesting case in that they have high inflation, a lot of financial management issues in country, and government policies that every once in a while kind of interdict their way into that. So I guess I'd say in the past, if farmers need cash now, they'll send beans to generate cash. If they don't need cash now, then they have been using soybeans and some of their other ag commodities as inflation hedges. So they'll hold them and have that be their bank account because their currencies are so prone to being devalued by inflation. So yeah, I would agree with what Guy said on that, and that they have ongoing issues and challenges. And I guess I'm thinking that it struck me in the last week or so that if we were looking at this situation a year ago in terms of what the world grain markets are doing, and had said, well, Ukraine has been in a war, Argentina is in a major drought, and it said, well, gosh, those are the third and fourth largest corn and wheat exporting countries in the world. And for Argentina, they're the third largest soybean exporter. To stand back at that time and have realized a year ago what has happened in these 12 months to get us to now, I guess we wouldn't be surprised that beans are at $15, on the futures, or that corn has gotten to the lofty levels that it has up front at $6.70, in fact, and having been higher at times. So we've just come through a real time of volatility in all the financial markets and geopolitically, and it's affected us in a major way in the ag commodities.
Oh, and not to mention locally, we're dealing with a year-long drought nearly.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And here I'm get so focused on the geopolitical things. We talked a little bit before we came on the air about here being in February, what are farmers thinking about the markets? And in general, I think that we've had several weeks now of sideways movement. There's uncertainty about where things will go. We've seen some input costs fall to some degree anyway. That'd be for fertilizer, and that would affect the feed grains. So I think there's some trepidation. I think in a lot of areas we still have not fully recharged for soil profile moisture. That brings some anxiety probably on where we're going. So I guess on the positive side, there are a couple things we can encourage people to keep in mind. First of all is that it does sound like the La Nina weather pattern shows signs of weakening, so that likely give us more moisture. That's a positive. More bushels being better than less. Also, our strongest times in markets typically aren't February or even March. They're more like April, May, June, with some receding into January. So most of our seasonal price strength is out in front of us. When you look at historically, February is just pretty tight and sideways. And we're in the tight and sideways time for cash prices for grains in Kansas. And so I guess I try to exhort and encourage people with that again, the seasonality, that will be For wheat, it's right around the corner, March 1. We break dormancy. And won't be long, we'll be in the field, and all those worries will be in mind for the grain markets as to whether the crops will get in or not. And so there's a lot to look forward to, but we're just in a time frame with these sideways movements. It makes people sit back and hope for better days, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, that USDA report that you mentioned at the beginning of the top of the show being the most exciting thing that's happened in the market really is of late. So, which, no excitement's not always a bad thing.
Well, it's not a bad thing. The big excitement for us is, again, these Argentina drought being a surprise that it was. So there is a USDA Outlook conference coming up in a couple weeks. We'll see what that brings about. I think there'll be a spotlight on acreage estimates and what the USDA says about anticipated yields. Yield anticipation's a huge thing in our part of the world with the dry situation we're coming out of here in the Western Corn Belt.
Yeah, and you'll be there at that USDA conference. So, of course, we'll look forward to hearing when you come back and what you will be sharing with us in terms of what you've gleaned from all that information that you'll be hearing about, and look forward to those conversations for sure. But Dan, thanks so much for this update this week. Like I said, not crazy eventful, but at least sharing some insight on what's to come. So that's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care, Samantha.
You as well. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's Grain Market Update. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be back with our friends from the Beef Cattle Institute to talk about their new podcast, Bovine Science with BCI, as well as some rural veterinary grant programs available through the USDA, as well as through K-State specifically for K-State students. So stay tuned for that and more ahead on Agriculture Today. Is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by several guests. I'm in a different studio location because I'm in their world right now. I'm with the team from BCI's Cattle Chats. You're used to hearing them every Wednesday during our Ask the Expert segment. But today I'm joined by Brad White. Brad, thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Bob Larson.
Hello.
Dustin Pendell.
Hello.
And Brian Lubbers.
Hi.
Thank you all for having me in your world. Like I said, I've joined them on Cattle Chat as well as we're recording this. But today I really wanted to speak with them because they've started up a new podcast. And listeners may be thinking, this team already has, it seems like, so many different things going on. So Bovine Science with BCI. What was the reasoning behind creating a whole new podcast?
So good question, Samantha. One of the things that we had talked about previously, and we've had listener questions about, we'd like to have a little more depth on some of the topics, and we'd like to have a little more information about specific areas, but doesn't necessarily fit our other podcasts. And so it's a different format. So Bovine Science with BCI is a one-on-one format. So basically there's one expert talking about their area. So a couple that aren't here with us today, Scott Fritz does a toxicology segment, Philip Lancaster does nutrition, Bob does some repro, Brian does some pharmacology antibiotic. But it's really about taking scientific information, so the research that's been done, and translating it into something that would be actionable for veterinarians or producers.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that, here in an academic setting, the discovery part, the research part of what we do is really important, but it's hard to communicate in actionable items. Because a lot of times you need to pull together several research projects, several different ways of asking a question. And, in other formats, it's hard to get into the depth in a way that is still takes what it was a research study and take it into actionable things that we have learned. And we don't really do that with our other podcast. And I think just writing papers and telling people to go read the paper isn't always the best way to communicate some of those things that we've learned.
Well, for me, it comes down to your audience, right? And so there are definitely journals that have a clinical audience. There are journals that have a producer audience. But a lot of times when I'm writing a journal, I'm writing it to other scientists. So I'm writing it in a way that if they read it, they could go replicate the exact same work, the exact same way to see if they get the same results. So again, it comes a little bit down to your audience. But I think Bovine Science with BCI, we're taking the same writing but translating it to that different audience.
Dustin, you've talked about that on Ag Econ papers, right? That sometimes being able to share that more broadly, that's kind of one of the goals that we're doing.
Yeah, like Brian was saying, when I write generally to 15 livestock economists, PhD economists, right? And so it's a whole different writing style. It's a whole different communication, who you're trying to communicate to. And so, yeah, it's definitely different. It's a challenge early on to learn, understand how to communicate to that different audience.
Brian, yours, which is called After the Abstract, you really kind of get into the details of breaking out, okay, here's what they said and here's what they did. How do we interpret it?
Yeah, that's kind of the goal of that particular podcast is we cover mostly pharmacology topics, but we kind of move around, and it's really about training the reader how to look at that scientific article and look at, okay, this is something they did well. This is something they didn't do well in the article, or they didn't describe it well. It's actually a very similar approach that we take with our graduate students, right? We're training them to read those articles and pull out those details that are important in the interpretation. And so we've kind of taken it and translated it to hopefully our clinical audience.
In the same way, clinical stuff, Scott Fritz, who's not here, is toxicologist. He takes individual cases and works through those cases. And we've talked about other clinical cases, going through those and kind of walking through the process of what is our diagnostic process, what is our prognostic process, how we're going to move forward.
I love it. It mirrors a lot of what I guess the role of extension really is. When we think about our partners with land-grant universities and extension programming, they go hand in hand, obviously. But that's the goal of those programs, is to communicate science. So you guys are doing that in the world of BCI, and I think that's really cool.
Excellent. Thanks, Samantha.
Yeah. So listeners, be sure to check that out. That's Bovine Science with BCI. You can find it on their website, the same place you find Cattle Chats. So stay tuned. More episodes are going to be released here in the future. But gentlemen, I also wanted to talk about today while I was in the studio with you all, this Rural Veterinary Practice Grants program that I've been seeing, it feels like, across a lot of articles that K-State has put out. So what does that really include?
I can start a little bit. So the USDA established a couple programs to help with veterinary workforce shortages, particularly in rural areas. And so there's actually two programs underneath that. It's the Veterinary Services Act that they came out of. And the first one is the VMLRP, which is Veterinary Medical Loan Repayment Program. And this program mirrors programs that have existed in human medicine for a while. So if you're a physician and you go practice in a rural area, they will pay back some of your student loans or all of your student loans in exchange for service time in these shortage areas. So the program is mirrored off of that. And gosh, the program's probably 12 or 13 years old now. It's been going on for quite a while. And so it's a two-step process. The first step is the animal health official within a state nominates areas within their state. They say, this is a shortage area for us. And they kind of describe the shortage area, what animal species, and it has to be food animals. So what livestock species need to be covered, what the geographical area is, and kind of what services need to be provided. And sometimes it's very specific. So we need service to a livestock market, or most of the time it's pretty, we need general service coverage of these types of duties. And so those shortage areas are reviewed, and then they get published on the USDA's website. And then the second step is, so individual applicants. So these are veterinarians apply to that shortage. And that's a competitive program. So you write basically a proposal that it's an application, how I would fit that area and what my qualifications are and how I kind of see my long-term vision for that area and basically how I would remediate that shortage area. And probably the reason you've seen so much recently is because we're getting close to the point now where I don't know if those are published quite yet, but certainly we're getting close to that application period. And so people are starting to write those applications and they're going to start applying for that, and then they'll find out. And so the program, just one last detail, is if you are selected for that program, it will pay up to $25,000 a year for 3 years of your veterinary student loans back. So it's a pretty important program.
Especially when you think about the need for veterinarians in such rural areas. I feel like that is a common discussion that I hear regularly, is some of our veterinarians in these rural areas, they're stretched so thin. And when you think about the stress of a job as a veterinarian anyways, especially working with livestock, being stretched even thinner by having to travel very long distances or, fitting as many patients in a day as you practically can, it's overwhelming. So programs like this help kind of alleviate that stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, as Brian mentioned, there's two programs. So the VMLRP, the Veterinary Medical Loan Repayment Program that he talked about, goes to the individual veterinarian. They have to be serving in one of those shortage areas, which if you're interested, you can actually look up. If you Google USDA veterinary shortage areas, you'll find a list of what the shortage areas are in your state. Those change year to year. There's a companion program that's called the Veterinary Services Grant Program that's focused on rural practice enhancement, and that goes to the practice. So the one that Brian mentioned goes to the individual veterinarian in that shortage area. There are also grants for that individual practice to grow. And the goal of both these is identify, as you mentioned, there are areas we're stretched on veterinarians. Can we identify some of those areas and provide some help? And there are some great success stories there for those veterinarians that have gone through both programs.
Wonderful opportunity for those that are interested. So if you have any veterinarians tuning into Ag Today, might be a chance for them.
Absolutely. The interesting thing about this is it is a USDA process, so there's paperwork involved.
Yeah.
It is not always easy to go through that process. So start early and find someone to help because they're both grant programs. Not all grants are funded. You need to have a strong application, a good story, a good response, and read carefully what do they want and be sure that what you're putting down is going to satisfy that. And then there are people out there that have gone through processes like this before. And if you can find a previous applicant, talk to them about what worked or find somebody that you can talk to because it's not easy the first time through.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe finding someone that's experienced in grant writing specifically and kind of help them build the backbone of that proposal.
Yep, absolutely.
And from what I understand, there's a program specific to K-State students, right?
So there's one for K-State students that's called the Veterinary Training Program for Rural Kansas. That program helps fund those students as they go through school, and then they have to serve in a rural area in Kansas for 4 years after. That program's been going about 15 years, and over 95% of those students have gone through and completed their service. Over 80% of them are still in the practice that they originated in, which is amazing. So they're all still out doing rural practice.
So I think one of the things that, as you are well aware, I think some veterinary shortage areas are an issue for many communities. And while there is no quick fix, I think there is a lot of people that have taken this problem seriously and really trying to address it in a way that maybe has some long-term stability.
And the one other comment I would make, the differentiation, the program here in Kansas, they actually enter that in veterinary school, and there's training associated with it. So they go through 4 years of training, which is a little bit different than the USDA programs, which occur after you get out of school and you apply for those. So the one in veterinary school comes along with some additional things, which we think has helped the success rate of those students in practice.
Absolutely. Equipping them so there's some more longevity there in those situations. Great opportunity for students here at K-State. Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you all enough for joining us today for this segment. I always enjoy coming over here and speaking with you all, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, those were some of our experts from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. Brad White, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, and Dustin Pendell. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
Today, we are ending today's show as we always do with Chip Redmond, our K-State meteorologist, for this week's agricultural weather report. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yep, thanks for letting me blow in.
Absolutely. So this past week, let's talk through some of the weather that we saw. We had some abnormally warm temperatures last weekend. Was that widespread across the state?
Yeah, for the most part, everybody except for that far northwest where they still had the snow cover that lingered. But even now, we've melted most of that off. And so that warmer temperatures helped erode that snowpack a little quicker than I thought it would. But warmth was had across the state. We had some breezy winds that went along with it. We actually saw some fires over the weekend as well and this week. But so things warmed up a little bit, a little taste of spring before we're getting cooler temperatures now at least.
Absolutely. And those cooler temperatures brought some snow later in the week, especially for Olathe?
Yeah, there was forecasted precipitation for the eastern third of the state. And we thought there might be a dusting of snow, but, man, it overestimated. There's a lot more moisture content than we expected. Some places got over an inch of rain alone. Then it switched over into these huge, massive snowflakes. And some areas got 3 inches of snow or more in eastern Kansas and western Missouri. So not quite what they expected. I know roads were pretty rough. And that's one of the biggest snows, if not the biggest snow they've had all winter so far. So substantial just for the fact that people weren't prepared for it and they weren't thinking along those lines. Manhattan area, we snuck out without another snow, and that 3 inches would have doubled our season-to-date snowfall. We're still sitting at about 3 inches, and if we were to end the season right now, that would tie 2016, 2017 for the least snow in a winter. Obviously, there's still a lot of time to go yet, and a lot more, hopefully not random snow events like they had this week. But it's not just Manhattan area either. We're looking down into the southwest as well as down by Wichita and southeast Kansas as well. So a lot of places haven't seen snow, but nobody wants to see snow when they weren't expecting it.
Sure. And these back and forth weather patterns that we've really seen, we went from low lows, extreme lows, I would say, to extreme highs in the span of a week or so. So that back and forth combined with some of this precipitation, what does that mean for our soils?
Yeah, so I think soils are really confused. They don't know to freeze or not freeze, and it's really kind of resulted in a lot of mud, where that when we warmed up, we had enough frozen soil that it took a while for it to melt, and so it held that moisture, and it didn't allow that moisture to evaporate off the surface. And so when it unfreezes, it becomes a muddy mess. And then we just keep adding moisture in eastern Kansas. We need moisture, but to some extent, we don't need an inch of rain in the wintertime. That's just not good moisture because it typically runs off more, doesn't soak in as well. There's nothing actively using it, so it's going to sit there and linger, which is good for growing season, but bad if you want to get in the field or do work with cattle or anything like that because it equals a lot of mud. And we also think about the fire component too, as we enter our fire season and we have a lot of surface moisture, a lot of stuck fire trucks, and we can't attack fire as readily as we normally would.
Absolutely. Good to know for sure. And when we think about the week ahead, I know February 13th is a date that sticks out to you because that's one of our record lows that we've ever experienced in Kansas.
Yeah, it's always fun to turn around and revisit that. The state record cold temperature is negative 40 degrees. It was set up in Lebanon on February 13th of 1905. And, that's a reminder that we can still get really cold air in February. I'm sure a lot of folks still remember 2021. But we are averaging warmer temperatures as we go each week. Our temperature averages climb up a degree or two each week, as well as our precipitation averages now. We were past our driest time of the year, and now we're starting to see, we're going from 0.3 of an inch to 0.4 of an inch in central Kansas on average by week. So not a big change, but we're on the upward swing now. And thankfully, no cold snaps like that are expected in the near future, but just a friendly reminder that we can still get very, very cold in our coldest air as we get later into winter.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, thanks so much for this update. Once again, we expect to hear from you every single week, and I know producers look forward to these updates as well.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Yep, once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for this week's Agricultural Weather Report. That concludes this week's programming. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.